One of the most noteworthy developments since the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war has been the outbreak of the fires of unknown origin in Russia, especially immediately after Russian leader Vladimir Putin declared partial mobilization on September 21st. The number of fires of unknown origin increased. The fact that these fires occur in military equipment, production facilities, factories, and buildings belonging to the Russian security forces brings to mind the Russian people who do not want to participate in the occupation of Ukraine. Ukrainian sabotage and partisan groups. However, the causes of most of the fires remain unexplained. The other day there was a big fire in Russia. Moreover, the place where the fire broke out was a very important building for Russia because this building was the service building of the Russian Federal Security Service, which is responsible for border security, intelligence, and counterterrorism. We have done important research to report the details about the fire in the Security Service building. You can support our Anchor Daily News team who works to report this news and all developments in the Russia-Ukraine war accurately and impartially by clicking the Super Thanks button. Let's examine this important development in Russia together. The Security Service building in Rostov, Russia, caught fire after a violent explosion. The fire increased its intensity in a short time. In the images shared on social media, it was stated that the fire rose about 30 meters. With this, a huge cloud of smoke covered the city of Rostov. The fire spread over an area of 800 meters squared. Two walls of the burning building collapsed. Russian traffic police banned the passage of cars on some of the roads in the area. There was heavy traffic in the city of Rostov. Russian media reported at least one person died and 2 people were injured as a result of the fire. It is estimated that the number of dead and injured extracted from the fire debris will increase. Fire brigades of the Russian Emergencies Ministry arrived at the scene with 25 special vehicles and 63 personnel. The street where the burning building was located has been taken under security tape, according to the security service. The fire started around 12:30 local time. It took about 4 hours to bring the fire under control and extinguish it. Residents and local news agencies in Rostov said that violent explosions were heard in the area before the fire. Following these statements, claims that there was an ammunition depot in the building came to the agenda, but these claims were not confirmed. Images shared on social media and statements made by Russian officials showed that the allegations were not true and provided information about the cause of the explosions. Russian authorities made a statement about the cause of the fire in the Security Service building. The Russian Security Service explained the cause of the fire as the ignition and explosion of mineral oils and fuel oil in a workshop inside the building. Rostov Governor Vasily Golubev said that the explosion was caused by the ignition of electrical cables. Many comments were made after the announcement about the explosion in Rostov. These comments included that Ukrainian partisan and sabotage groups were behind the fire. However, this claim was quickly refuted by Mikhailo Podolyak, a senior aide to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, with a post on his social media account. Podolyak wrote as follows: "Any FSB building that burns or explodes in RF, especially in Rostov region, clearly indicates that this is a manifestation of panic, weakening of power control, and transition to a major internal conflict. Ukraine doesn't interfere, but watches with pleasure." Podolyak's statement, "Ukraine doesn't interfere, but watches with pleasure," attracted a lot of attention. Ukrainian social media accounts also shared many posts about the fire, so much so that many social media users wrote that smoking Russian soldiers blew up the building. These ironic posts, along with mocking the statements of Russian officials, were a reference to the smoke rising during the fire. Russia lost a strategic unit with the fire in the Security Service building because the building that caught fire belonged to the Border Patrol Department of the Security Service. It is noteworthy that the city of Rostov is only 75 miles from the Ukrainian border. The city of Rostov borders Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk regions. There are intense clashes have been taking place since the beginning of the Ukrainian occupation. The fact that the Russian invaders' unit monitoring the activity on the Ukrainian border was engulfed in flames caused great fear in the Kremlin because the Ukrainian army is crossing the occupied territories and approaching Russia. The fire in Rostov brought to mind an incident that took place in Rostov in the past. In the past months, the Russian security service announced that it had arrested 3 people. They were Russian teenagers, 2 of them 17 and one 21 years old. They did not want to participate in the invasion of Ukraine for Putin's personal interests and career. For this reason, they were caught when they were about to set fire to the military conscription and registration office in Rostov. But a Molotov cocktail. The number of fires of unknown origin in Russia is increasing every day, so much so that explosions and fires have occurred in many regions of Russia in recent days. Here are some of the fires and explosions in the last 10 days. A major fire broke out at a military aviation school and oil refinery in Krasnodar, Russia. An industrial warehouse in Odintsovo, Moscow, also went up in flames at night. A major fire also broke out at a plastic production factory in the Moscow village of Kolyawakino. Developments in the last 10 days alone show that if Russian leader Vladimir Putin does not give up the occupation, Russia will burn to ashes. Along with all these developments, the Russian army is also suffering heavy losses on the front line. The successful attacks of the Ukrainian army have cornered the Russian invaders in every aspect. The Ukrainian army is recording its operations, hunting Russian invaders with drone cameras. These images are shared by thousands of social media users. Hours after the fire in Russia, new images of operations in the occupied territories were shared on social media. In one of the images shared, Ukrainian soldiers are seen blowing up Russian tanks after the guided anti-tank missile fired by Ukrainian soldiers hit the Russian tanks with a direct hit. Ukrainian soldiers rejoice. The Russian army, on the other hand, is very worried about the increasing loss of soldiers and ammunition. The losses of the Russian army since the beginning of the war are as follows: 162,560 military personnel, 3,504 tanks, 6,810 armored fighting vehicles, 2,539 artillery systems, 503 reactive spread fire systems, 265 air defense systems, 305 aircraft, 289 helicopters, 5,390 for automotive and tank equipment, 18 military ships and boats, 907 cruise missiles, 2,145 unmanned aerial vehicles, 257 special machines for operational tactical missile systems dropped between fires and losses. Putin was unable to invade Ukraine despite as many moves. If the war continues like this, it seems impossible for Putin to invade Ukraine, so much so that Russian leader Vladimir Putin may give up his decision to invade at any moment. Do you think Putin will give up his decision to invade? What could be the reason for the ever-increasing fires in Russia? What are your thoughts on the success of the Ukrainian army? The Ukrainians managed to make a huge surprise to the Russians in the Solder area. After stepping a little bit back from their initial positions in Solder, they drew in a lot of Russian forces that wanted to maintain the momentum and push the Ukrainians as far as possible. However, it turned out that the Ukrainians had a lot of underground passages, and so because the front line shifted westward, the Ukrainians were able to suddenly appear right behind Russian backs and cause a lot of trouble. Yesterday, I told you that the Ukrainian control over the eastern part of Solder was compromised because the Russians established total control over Yakovlevka and started attacking them from the flank. I told you that the Ukrainians retreated from the local school in Bakhmutka towards the warehouses and from the factory now in Solder, around 3 streets back. Today it turned out that the retreat process was incomplete and that the Ukrainians decided to leave warehouses in Bakhmutka as well, despite the fact that the Russians seemingly received an order to cease fire. The Russians tried to take advantage of that and pushed in the direction of Soledar. Interestingly, the Soledar area is mostly the responsibility of the Wagner forces, so it looks like they have some latitude as to how tightly the orders from the Russian Ministry of Defense should be followed. In any case, the latest updates indicate that the fights are taking place in the area of the train station, Decoin Square. The latest updates also suggest that even though the area of Ukrainian control shrank by several kilometers, it does not mean that the Russians have total control over the empty territory. Today, Russian sources confirmed that Russian forces experienced huge problems with moving forward in solidarity. The reason why the Russians can't even start storming the central part of Soledar is that the Ukrainians are using various secret tunnels to get into the Russian rear and sabotage it. As you remember yesterday, I told you that the Ukrainians are fully controlling a salt mine that has an incredibly developed network of underground communication. A lot of caves and tunnels lead to the eastern part of Solidarity, since the eastern part of Soledar is behind the contact line. The Russians do not monitor every block that they assume is under their control, so the Ukrainians can deploy in small groups, leave some mines, destroy small ammunition depots and some equipment, and sneak back. The Russians struggle to reveal the entrances to the tunnels, and therefore they cannot move in their equipment closer to the front to maintain their positions. They are permanently, so even though the Ukrainians stab back by several kilometers, most of the area that they left is going to remain in the gray zone, creating a valuable buffer in front of the main stronghold in the central part of the city. More news is coming from the southern region. Several days ago, the Ukrainians deployed a small group to the island Veliki Potyomkin and placed a Ukrainian flag. Later, the head of the southern group of forces elaborated that this was basically a signal to the Russians to leave this island as fast as possible. Today, the Russians made a response and started shelling the bridge that connects the Ukrainian-controlled land to the island. Some sources are saying that the Russians are likely using this island to shell Kherson. The Russians reportedly moved in their artillery systems, make a full salvo, and quickly pull back in order to ensure the safety of the city. The Ukrainians are trained to at least put this island in the gray zone, and while nothing suggests that the Ukrainians are conducting active on-the-ground operations today, there were a lot of reports of big explosions along the front line. The explosions were inflicted by the Ukrainian Air Force, which has conducted a series of fire missions with a specific focus on Ilysk and Radunsk. These are quite big settlements located right on the main Russian highway, so there have always been a lot of soldiers stationed in the region. While the Ukrainian General Staff is still gathering information about the results of these strikes, they have published a report about yesterday's strikes. They stated that over the last several days, the Ukrainians had identified the areas of concentrations of Russian forces near Tokmak and Gavrilov-Kadria. As a result of targeting military objects, the Ukrainians have inflicted irretrievable losses of 80 mobilized soldiers in Tokmak and 100 soldiers in Havrilivka. Local news reported that the Russians are seizing the property of the farmers and turning their hangars for equipment into barracks. The Russians suspect that a lot of locals are helping the Ukrainians and linking the targets, and given their attitude towards the locals, it is hardly surprising. The Ukrainian army is conducting historic operations to liberate Russian-occupied territories. According to the data shared by the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, 740 soldiers have died in the Russian army in the last 24 hours. Russia is experiencing the most difficult days in history. How did the Russian army suffer such a defeat in such a short period of time? What is the reason for the defeat of the Russian army? In which regions does the Ukrainian army have the upper hand? Let's answer these questions one by one. First of all, it should be noted that the Ukrainian army has clearly gained the upper hand in this war. The Ukrainian army has managed to liberate more than half of the territories occupied by Russia. Russia is losing control over more and more territories. The Ukrainian army continues to strike Russia's bases using HIMARS, A military barracks in the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol was destroyed by the Ukrainian army. According to the Ukrainian army, more than 200 Russian soldiers lost their lives in this operation. According to reports in the British press, Russian forces were using a hotel in Melitopol as a barracks. The HIMARS used by Ukraine managed to completely destroy this hotel. The Russian army cannot find a place to stay in the occupied territories. Russian soldiers are experiencing great fear. Many of the soldiers in Melitopol started to flee from the hotels where they were staying. Some of the Russian soldiers surrendered to the Ukrainian army, while others are trying to hide in the homes of local residents. The city of Melitopol in Zaporizhia Oblast is of great strategic importance. If the Ukrainian army manages to liberate Melitopol, it will get closer to the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. This could completely change the course of the war. The Russian military is massing troops around the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. This plant, one of the largest nuclear power plants in Europe, is being used by the Russian military for a nuclear threat. The Ukrainian army does not bomb this area remotely to prevent damage to the nuclear power plant. That's why Russia is building up a military buildup around the plant. However, the Ukrainian army is getting closer to this base every day. If the Ukrainian army manages to end the Russian occupation of this power plant, the Russian army will suffer a huge loss. Russia's losses are increasing day by day. Having established superiority in Melitopol, the Ukrainian army continues to carry out very important operations in other regions. Bakhmut is one of the areas where clashes are intensifying. The Russian army is making a great effort to occupy this town in Ukraine's Donetsk Oblast. However, the Ukrainian army does not allow Russia to occupy this town. The International Institute for the Study of War has been publishing striking reports on the conflict in this region. According to these reports, Russia is suffering huge losses here. Russia made one of its biggest mistakes since the beginning of the war by trying to invade this area. Bakhmut has been one of the most damaged areas for the Russian army. Having retreated on all fronts, the Russian army launched an offensive to win the war in one region. By occupying this region, Russia was planning to make more intense propaganda against its own people. But the Ukrainian army is disrupting this plan of Putin by following very important strategies in this region. The Ukrainian army manages to repel Russia's attacks. Another explosion in this war took place at a base for Russian army mercenaries. Soldiers of the Wagner Group, Russia's mercenary company, are staying in hotels in the occupied territories. The mercenaries are staying in a hotel in the city of Kadayevka in the Luhansk region, suffered heavy damage in the face of an attack by the Ukrainian army. Governor Sergei Hayday said that the hotel was hit by Ukrainian forces and the elite soldiers of the group suffered huge losses. According to the governor, half of the soldiers in the hotel died as a result of this attack. The soldiers of the Wagner Group are considered one of the most important forces in the Russian army. These mercenaries are notorious for their war crimes in all wars. Wagner mercenaries were planning to kill many soldiers in Ukraine, but the Ukrainian army put the Wagner mercenaries in their place, thanks to the brave operations of the Ukrainian army. The Wagner mercenaries did not gain any advantage. Soldiers of the Wagner Group are experiencing great fear in Ukraine. Some of these soldiers reportedly want to resign. One of the mercenaries of this group tried to escape from the war. While escaping, he clashed with the Russian army. As a result of the mercenaries' escape, there was a major crisis in Russia. The conflict between the Kremlin and the Wagner Group in Russia started to increase. In this process, soldiers belonging to the Wagner Group found the rebel soldier and executed him. Images of the soldier killed by hitting his head with a sledgehammer were shared. The Russian government did nothing about the execution of the soldier. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group and a close friend of Orton, made a very interesting statement about this video. "I hope no animals were harmed during the filming," Prigozhin said after Prigozhin's cruel statement. Anti-war activists in Russia were outraged. There was a major dispute between the Kremlin and the Wagner Group in Russia. Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, is one of the most popular people in Russia. It is claimed that there is a disagreement between Prigozhin, known as Putin's chief, and Putin. These disagreements could cause a major split in Russia as a result of Ukraine's successes. Disagreements between politicians in Russia are growing. There are also many disagreements within the Russian army. Most Russian commanders have long been proposing a retreat in this war. Putin's government insisted on not accepting any of these proposals. However, as a result of Ukraine's great successes, Russia was forced to withdraw from the Kherson region. Kherson is the largest regional capital occupied by Russia, and Ukraine became one of the turning points of the war. The Russian army has been forced to retreat in other areas as well. Russia's retreat in this war is increasing every day. The Russian army, which has lost a total of 96,000 soldiers, is forced to retreat to avoid further losses. Some forces of the Russian army are reportedly leaving their positions and heading to Crimea. Crimea, occupied by Russia in 2014, is one of the most critical points in this war. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in liberating Crimea, this war could be over for good. Russian leader Vladimir Putin is afraid of losing control over Crimea because if the Russian occupation of Crimea ends, Putin will suffer a huge loss of face. Putin is not ready for this big defeat. The Russian army is digging trenches in many areas in Crimea. Preparations are being made for a big defense in this region, but the Ukrainian army is determined to liberate Crimea. Ukrainian leader Zelensky refers to Crimea as the place where Russia's occupation began. He often emphasizes that Crimea must be free when this war is over. If the war spreads to Crimea, the Russian army is expected to suffer much bigger losses. The Ukrainian army is doing everything in its power to liberate Crimea. What do you think about the operations of the Ukrainian army? Do you think Russia's defeat will continue? Do you think the Ukrainian army will be able to liberate Crimea? Do you think Putin's political career will be over if Crimea is liberated?